I really enjoyed the past series. We started out with the theoretical, how science and religion interact in terms of miracles and the law of nature. And then we went into the scientific, how God's love is shown through the way he puts elements together and sets up our environment. And I believe we also went through the philosophical level of how theology gives foundations for empirical science. And so that's how, for instance, on the last one, how theology helps science. So I would like to hit today how the background of a scientific background can actually help theology. And usually we think science will make theology maybe a little less faithful to the Bible, not take things so literally. So I thought, why don't I share a few insights I found where science helps theology take the Bible more literally than they have been used to taking. And this is going to be kind of interesting. I'll start from a more general example and move to a very specific example. The three people, since we have 30 minutes, I can only give three. There's quite a few I have in mind, but the three stories I want to share today, 10 minutes each, are of Ishmael, Jacob, and Samuel, how God handles each one of these. And you'll see some nuances that are better picked up if you had a scientific background, or at least saw these as embodied physical beings, not just characters in a story, okay? Start with the banishment of Ishmael. Genesis 21 is one of the cruelest stories that people know of in the Bible. I mean, it looks like Sarah and God gangs up and basically banishes Ishmael for merely laughing at the toddler Isaac, which is really, really cruel. But what I'd like to suggest is if you look at it from a more embodied perspective, you may start seeing that this is a coming of age story. That maybe him being banished into the wilderness was not just for the protection of Isaac only, but that God was behind Sarah because he wanted to make Ishmael grow up and become the young man that he truly was, actualize who he was. First, I want to back up and tell you a little bit about Ishmael. In Genesis 16:12, the angel predicted his character even before he was born. He said he will be a wild donkey, his hand against everybody and everybody's hand against him. So literally a strong-willed child, okay? But notice how in this story, Genesis 21, verse 14, that's the one I'd like you to turn to. And if you have it on electronic device, see if you can hit the more literal translations. King James Version is a literal translation. RSV is a very good literal one. ESV is a good literal one. NIV is kind of loose, Some of these others, what I mean by that is you can't be totally literalistic because the order of words in Hebrew is totally different from the syntax in English. So every translation is in some sense a little bit of interpretation, okay? But many of the translators try to be as close as they can to be, and others say, no, let's get the general gist of the whole paragraph through. So they take a little more license. There's a whole spectrum. Now, this is what I want to point out. In Genesis 21:14, how Abraham and Hagar handle Ishmael. It says, and Abraham rose up early in the morning and took bread and a flask of water and gave it to Hagar, setting it on her shoulder and the child, and sent her away. Now, if you read this straight through and didn't know the age of the child, the natural reading means that the child and the flask of water were both put on her shoulder, because it says to put the flask of water on her shoulder with the child, and the child with the child. The language is nebulous. So if you thought it was a young child, you'd be like, oh yeah, of course, she's piggybacking. It's only theologians and translators who look at the whole picture and say, wait a minute, Ishmael's 17 years old at this point. We know that because the age has been given when Isaac was born and when Ishmael was born. And now that he's weaned, 3 to 5 years later, he's about 17. So most theologians and translators go, there's no way a woman is going to be carrying a 17-year-old teenager on her back. And that is why the looser translations will kind of separate the putting on the shoulder from and the child. They'll say, he also gave her the child, or add a few extra words to say, these two are not connected. The child is not on her back. I suggest we take the text literally. Leave it alone. Let it say what it says. I believe Ishmael was being piggybacked on her shoulders like a backpack. Maybe there was a sling or something. It's early in the morning. And I think Hagar carried him into the wilderness. Let me give you 3 more evidences from the text why I think this is right. The very next verse says that after the water ran out and she wandered around, it says, Hagar flung, threw, cast, dumped the child under a bush. The word is shalak. In Hebrew, that means throw with some force and distance. It's totally different from the Hebrew word before, when Abraham set the flask of water on her shoulder, placed, carefully. And even in the story of Isaac, Abraham picks up Isaac and places him set on the wood. Totally different from here, where Hagar flings, cast. When they flung Jeremiah into the dungeon, they use this word. So I'm thinking, if he's walking beside her and he's near death, he starts slumping, would she really literally fling him? Or wouldn't she just roll him and place him nicely under a bush? But if she was carrying him and she recognizes he's becoming unresponsive and thinks that he's close to dying, the only way to put him down is to dump him, to drop him under a bush. So those are 2 areas where I think translators kind of glossed over because they could not imagine this happening. But is it impossible for a mother to carry a 17-year-old? I'm a mother. I can carry my 17-year-old Zoe, my 18-year-old Luke, or my 20-year-old Delilah. I've done it. I can't go far because I'm pretty sedentary and out of shape. But Hagar is a working slave woman, and she's 30 or 40 at this time. And Ishmael is her most precious treasure. It's her whole world. I see no problem with Middle Eastern working women carrying huge loads like a 17-year-old on her back. It's doable. 2 more hints in the text support me. And this, in all the translations, it does come through. Every time that Abraham or Hagar interacts or refers to Ishmael, and he's 17 now, they call him child, Yalad, the same word they use for Isaac's weaning. But every time God refers to Ishmael in this story, like when he promises he'll grow up to be a great nation, and when the angel refers to Ishmael under the bush, they don't use that same word, child. They use the word na'ar, boy, lad, teenager, young man. They're both talking about the same kid. One consistently refers to them, this team here, Abraham and Hagar, consistently refers to, and the narrator does it too at the beginning, child, and then God consistently refers as a young man, a lad, a teen. I think they relate to the same person and see him differently. And here's the last cincher. When the angel rescues Hagar by opening her eyes, letting her see a well, it's verse 18. He says, arise, lift up the lad, and very specifically, hold him in your hand, for I will make him a great nation. And this is not the normal word for hold. It is chazak. Seize him, grasp him firmly, hold him strongly. Your better English translations that are literal will put that across. They'll say, hold him firmly, they'll say, because it does show some strength. The angel is literally saying or implying, don't pick him up and carry him anymore. Get him up, hold him strongly. He is a young man, for he will become a great nation. And the text tells us, from the time he cries out to God under the bush, which actually actualizes his name, Ishmael, which means God has heard. The angel said, God has heard the lad, because she lifted up her voice and cried. But the angel is pointing out, it's only when Ishmael is close to death, he finally cries out for me. Now I can work with him. And so Ishmael grows up, becomes a great archer. He provides for both of them. And I would suggest that maybe, if I'm looking through the whole thing and seeing it, maybe Abraham and Hagar were spoiling this strong-willed child. Because when you do not let a strong-willed child become significant and contribute, they become extremely frustrated and nasty and selfish and ruined, like a brat. And maybe God is saying, okay, this kid actually needs to have a role to play. Send him out with his mom, and I will turn him into a man. And the Bible tells us later, he does become a great nation, the head of 12 independent, fierce tribal chiefs. And so here's a place where I would suggest to tell the theologians, stick to the text more closely. This was for Ishmael's sake, for him to grow up and actualize the potential that God saw in him. That's the first one. It's more general. Let's move on to Jacob. One verse in Jacob, but I'll just start with a little background and come up to it. Jacob with the wrestling of the angel, and that's in Genesis 32. And my crucial verse is going to be verse 26, right when he begs the angel for a blessing, okay? Jacob's name was changed to Israel, which means wrestler of God, or wrestler over God, victorious wrestler in a sense. Because in Genesis 32:28, the angel says, thou hast striven with God and with men and have prevailed. But I would suggest that most believers are focused on the wrong wrestling phase. Every single painting and picture I've seen of Jacob wrestling with the angel is when he's upright or kneeling. Once I saw him kneeling, grabbing onto the thighs, but all the others, he's upright and he's pushing and straining, and the angel is pushing and straining, and they think this is why he's called wrestler with God. Well, let's back up and see what was God's role in all this. Back in the same chapter, earlier on verse 11, he said to God, deliver me, I pray thee, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he come and smite me, the mother with the children. So he's begging and he's desperate. Would God jump a person who is desperate and scared and begging for help? Kind of unlikely. It's more likely that God came to reassure him, I'm on your side, to come close to him. But Jacob projected his fear of Esau upon God and fought him off. This is how Ellen White describes it. Patriarchs and Prophets 196. Suddenly a strong hand was laid upon him. He thought that an enemy was seeking his life, and he endeavored to wrest himself from the grasp of his assailant. In the darkness, the two struggled for mastery. They wrestled all through the night. And finally, the angel, seeing that he could not prevail, is what the text says. I think it means seeing that he could not stop Jacob from mistakenly pushing him off. This useless grappling finally touches his hip, and it was disabled. Now, medically, there have been orthopedic surgeons, both Jews and Christians, who have looked very carefully to try to figure out what is this disability. And they cannot pinpoint it, given what the text says. It doesn't give us enough information to know exactly what it is. It just says he touched the hollow of his hip and it went wrong. Just generally went wrong. So some translations will help you and say it was dislocated. Other translations will say the ligament shrank. And other translations will say he damaged the nerve to it. Okay, we don't know, but something happened. What's clear is it was disabled acutely. In medicine, we know, and you have to imagine this bodily. If you have an acutely disabled hip or dislocated, you cannot put any weight on it, none at all. You cannot stand, you cannot kneel. And so when we come to this verse, verse 26, this is the pivotal verse. The angel says, let me go, right after he's dislocated his hip or hurt it somehow. Let me go, for dawn is breaking. And Jacob replied, I will not let you go until you bless me. Now, if he can't put any weight on that hip, and he's holding on to his opponent, all he has left for his weight is one knee and one other hand, which is not going to give you any balance at all. So I would suggest he's probably totally prone. He's prone, he's flat, because one hand is on his assailant and the other two are not going to support him. And if you are a prone assailant, if you're a wrestler and you're totally prone, what is the only part of your opponent's body that you can grab onto? The foot, the ankle. And so he's hanging on to the ankle. And here's the irony. The Bible doesn't tell you that, doesn't describe that to you. You have to just follow the words and in your head, imagine it as a real occurrence of a real human being and know this medical little tidbit and recognize he is prone, he's hanging onto the heel. And here's the irony, that Jacob, who came out of the womb hanging onto the heel of Esau, and all his life he's been straining to displace Esau and become Esau, is now finally hanging on to the heel of God, the only heel that he should have been hanging on to all his life. He actualizes his name, Jacob, deceiver, heel grabber. This is his rightful position spiritually. And in this position, he begs for a blessing. And that's when the angel says, what is your name? He says, Jacob, and he changes his name to Israel. If you were to ask the aged Jacob, are you proud that you wrestled with God all night long? I think he'd go, what? I wasted a whole night of shoving with God bodily and not talking when I could have spent a whole night of communing with God. He was right there. He would have considered that whole night of wrestling a total loss and wish he could probably redo it differently. Ellen White points this out. She quotes Hosea 12:4, where it says, Jacob had power over the angel and prevailed. And she goes right on to say, through humiliation, repentance, and self-surrender, this sinful, erring mortal prevailed with the majesty of heaven because he fastened his trembling grasp on the promises of God, and the heart of infinite love could not turn away the sinner's plea. Bible commentary, page 1095. So I would suggest it's the handicapped, heel-grabbing wrestling that turned Jacob into Israel. And I have yet to see a painting of that, because that kind of pleading, that kind of not letting go, knowing that God will in mercy turn to you and give you what you need, is far more spiritual than the initial wrestling of pushing him off, being blinded and fighting with him and thinking that's going to get you anywhere. It only ended up with a disabled hip and the angel threatening to leave him. That's not the right phrase. We need to read the Bible more carefully and see it's the phase of being totally knocked out and hanging on anyway. So that's my second example. The third one I'm going to take a risk on. I'm going to go outside Genesis and go to 1 Samuel because it's just so exciting. It's relevant because it's tied in my mind, to a diagnosis that medicine has only recognized in the last 10 years. Check this out. Okay, 1 Samuel 16, you know the story was the anointing of David, right? I have an MBA, and I must tell you that this is the worst way to pick a leader, okay? Literally, what Samuel ends up doing is like me going to my company and saying, okay, line up all the employees, and in front of everybody, serially, going from the first one and going, no, not you, no, 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 no. And then getting to the janitor and saying, you're the one. I'm going to make you office manager. I mean, I've just set up everybody to hate the one that's chosen. And that's what happens in the family dynamics. Those older brothers resent David because this is the technique that was used. Why would God impose this technique to Samuel and say, oh, this is how I want you to do it? I won't tell you which one it is. He could have jumped through all that by just giving one memo. Anoint David, son of Jesse, in Bethlehem. Period. That's efficient. That's better. I'd like to suggest that this is not so much for the benefit of David. It's actually to his detriment. Sets him up. It is for the benefit of Samuel. Notice 2 verses before this chapter, 1 Samuel 16. It says, then, this is 1 Samuel 15, verses 34 to 35, 2 verses. Then Samuel went to Ramah, that's his home, And Saul went up to his house in Gibeah of Saul. And Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death. But Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. Well, that's okay. That's expected. He has just told Saul, you've been rejected. The kingdom is taken away from you. He's going to grieve. This was his prodigy. This was to be the culminating task of his prophetic ministry. And it has gone to pieces. 1 Samuel 16:1 says, the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul? How long will you? God sounds exasperated. How long are you going to grieve over Saul? Now let me right here break off and give you the medical diagnosis I have in mind. I was reading the story and going, what matches? What could God be possibly doing for Samuel? And because I had recently read some articles, I went back to research it and found that around 2013, 2014, some articles came out to the medical community as a whole, diagnosing that within a subset, within the group of people who mourn and grieve, there is a subset that is intensely affected by their mourning. Usually, when you lose somebody, in about 6 months or so, you start picking up the pieces little by little. You start putting away their things, putting on your makeup, going to work, seeing a friend or two. I mean, you're still not over it. It takes a year and a half, they say, to get over most of it. But by 6 months, there's objective progress. Somebody starts going to work maybe one day a week or something. But this subset of people who mourn are totally incapacitated. At 6 months, there's no improvement whatsoever. And what's interesting about them is they feel this deep loneliness and emptiness of purpose. And something very unique, they long so much and so intensely for the person they've lost. But paradoxically, they avoid all triggers, all reminders. They will never go back to the restaurant where they ever went with that person. They will never visit the room that they were in. They will avoid anything that might remind them of it. But inside, they intensely are hung up on wanting that person back. This is called prolonged grief syndrome. And actually, the next issue of the psychiatric manual, DSM-5, which will come up in a couple of years, will also include this, but they have a much longer word for it. They call it persistent complex bereavement disorder. And I'm like, no, don't use that. Use prolonged grief syndrome, prolonged grief disorder, which is written by, that's the term used in the International Classification of Diseases. It's the coding for it. And they have found that, number one, meds don't help very much. And usual treatment therapy for grief does not help, which is more nurturing and reflecting and all that. Doesn't seem to help. There's only 3 therapies that seem to help consistently. And they are, number one, cognitive restructuring, helping the person stop their negative thoughts, reframe them in a way that's much more reasonable and broader than just all about them. Number 2, restoration therapy, helping them re-engage with a goal or a purpose, giving them a new aspiration to seek after. And number 3, this is the most unique one, exposure therapy. Make them go back to the grave site for just 1 second if they can't handle it, and then come back again a little longer, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, until finally it is bearable. Repetitive re-exposure, revisitation of what they're avoiding. Now watch how verse 1 wraps up 2 of these. It goes like this. The Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons. Prolonged mourning that exasperates even God. Reframing of his loss. It's not that you have failed as a kingmaker and Israel is now doomed because they have a mad king. I am still in charge, and I have rejected him, and I am sending you. You are still my guy because I have chosen a king for myself. So God is like trying to pull away from Samuel's neurotic, negative, failed feelings and say, it's really not about you. I am still in control, and you are still my prophet. Get going, get back to work, fill up your horn, and go. So I like how he doesn't say it's David. He says, one of Jesse's sons. A little curiosity, a new aspiration. Don't you want to see who I've chosen? Who the next king is going to be? That's genius. And so Saul picks up and goes, and we'll jump right to the lineup, okay? 1 Samuel 16, 6 through 10. And when they came, he looked upon Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look upon two things, his appearance or on the height of his stature. Now, what are the two physical characteristics we know that Saul, the first king, had? Goodly man, handsome, and head and shoulders above everybody else. Do you see how this is? This is going to evoke for Samuel, Saul. But for the Lord does not see as a man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. So then Jesse calls Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. Then Jesse made Shammah go by, and he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. This is exposure therapy. Again and again and again and again. Starting with the first one that probably reminds him most of Saul, and going through all 7 sons, and each time Samuel is revisiting the idea of kingship and the fact that he has to let go. It's not his project. It's not his little mission. It is God's job. He is just the messenger. So he relinquishes little by little his grief and his self-incrimination. And finally, let me ask you, what would healing look like in this case? Because in every therapy, you've got to say, what is my objective? How will I know if we've been effective? Notice verse 10 and 11. And Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen these. Then Samuel said to Jesse, are all of your sons here? So what we see is he could have easily at this point, when he went through all 7 and saw no more options in the room, he could have said, I failed again. I'm a worthless prophet. I mean, here again, I can't even be a kingmaker the second time. And he could have just gone back into his despair and his grief. But Samuel is a prophet. And in those days, a prophet was called a seer. And a seer sees more than normal human sight can see. See that? So he hangs on by faith now to God's word, believes that's true, and says, there must be something that I'm not seeing. I'm going to see beyond what's in this room. And he considers, are these all of your sons? And so, since he said no one's going to sit down and eat until he comes, in the time that David is called from the field, washed up, and presented before Samuel, I think Samuel is fully healed. He is willing to relinquish his disappointment and his control of the kingship of Israel, follow whoever God chooses, whether it is a mentally retarded person, a hunchback, anything. He's just willing to accept God. And luckily for him, it says, David was a handsome young man. And when he walks in the door, Samuel is able to relinquish his love of Saul and turn and support this new chosen one. And when David was running around as the most wanted man in Israel, he sought Samuel for encouragement, and Samuel encouraged him and said, yes, you are the one, I think. So I have to stop right out and give a little word of caution. I cannot be certain of this diagnosis. I don't have Samuel in front of me. I don't have the chance to ask him questions and get the full history. All I have is a text, right? But I would say maybe there's even a better diagnosis coming along in the future that will match these details even better. But I think this is interesting that it's only since 2013 that we've come across something that makes better sense of this story than any other story any other explanation that I can think of. And I think I'm on the right track contextually. Why? Because the very next story that follows immediately afterwards starts like this. Spiritual and mental illness. Watch. 1 Samuel 16:14. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him. So I'm thinking, this is probably a butterfly effect. You know, on one side, you have the prophet of God struggling with a real mental disorder, and the Lord heals him. On the other side, you have someone who's left God, now struggling with a spiritual and mental disorder. Let us see how God tries to heal him through David. You know, God cares about this. But it's kind of interesting to think, wow, God, for thousands of years, I don't think they had as good of an answer as we recently have available to us. It's a very relevant possibility of taking the text very seriously, reading the details carefully, because they do cohere and make sense in the end. So my final point is, we need church. We need everybody to bring their expertise to the table so we can all read the Bible together on Sabbath school and do sola scriptura, where the Bible gives us all the data, gives us the building blocks, the foundations, and also norms or tests, controls, the patterns that we bring to it. But we need each other. And I would recommend that in these three areas, this is not the traditional understanding of these stories, which points out to me that theologians need scientists. They need doctors. We need carpenters. We need people from all walks of life to say, if this story is taken literally, concretely in this same world, what are some details we may be missing without mangling and doing violence to the text? Let the text stand and let us understand it more fully and better. So whatever background you're from, you need to help theologians and become a theologian in a sense yourself. Reread these stories and use your life experience to see, how can I understand this better and make every detail and every part of it come alive in a way that does not mangle or do violence to the text.